In the end, justice took many forms. Some sought punishment, others
April
forgiveness.
1945.
When the outbreak began,
Bergen-Belsen
it wasn't the
concentration
enemy they
camp.
feared. It was the unseen
British soldiers stand
contagion
frozen at the
spreading through their
gates,
own ranks.
staring at something that will
Orders
haunt
were
them
given.
forever.
Isolation zones were
60,000 skeletal
drawn. But
prisoners,
discipline, too,
13,000
began to break under the weight
unburied
of fear.
corpses,
He
and
was
among
barely
them
20,
15,000 women
sent
guards
to
and
fight,
prisoners who hadn't
to
bathed
contain
in 6
what could
months.
not be seen.
The stench alone makes grown men
Every
vomit.
night, they buried more
But
than
here's
men.
the insane part.
They buried the hope
Nobody
that the
tells
world
you
would ever
these
feel
British
clean again.
liberators are about to face
it was
their
over,
most psychologically
blame
brutal
came easier
challenge
than
of the
understanding.
entire war.
Heroes became
Not from
suspects.
bullets, not from
Compassion
bombs,
became disobedience.
but from a simple order that will
sometimes
test every
duty
fiber
meant
of their
defiance.
humanity.
His choices
By the end
saved
of this
lives,
story,
though
their
history
decision
nearly
will save
forgot his name.
28,000 lives
later,
and create a
the pages
protocol
told
still
what the
used by the
reports could
UN
not.
today.
The humanity
This is the
that
story
survived
of
amid
Lieutenant Colonel
horror.
James Johnston, a 34-year-old
In the
Scottish
end,
schoolteacher
justice
turned
took many
soldier
forms.
who did something
Some
so
sought
forbidden
punishment,
that it nearly got him
others
court-martialed.
forgiveness.
But first, we need to understand why April 1945 was the worst moment to be a liberator. The spring of 1945 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. Hitler's Reich was crumbling. Soviet forces were hammering toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crushing through from the west. Victory was inevitable. Everyone knew it. But here's what they didn't tell you in history class: winning the war was the easy part. What came after? That's where the real nightmare began. See, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they started discovering something worse than any battlefield. The camps. Auschwitz in January, Buchenwald in April, and then, on April 15, 1945, British forces stumbled upon Bergen-Belsen. Nothing could have prepared them. The camp was designed for 10,000 people. It held 60,000. Typhus was spreading like wildfire. People were dying at a rate of 500 per day. The water supply was contaminated. Food was non-existent, and the smell soldiers 20 miles away could smell death in the air. But here's the part that broke everyone. The prisoners were so far gone that even with food and medicine, 14,000 more would die in the coming weeks. Their bodies simply couldn't handle survival anymore. The British Army had liberated hundreds of towns, fought dozens of battles, but nothing prepared them for this. And among all this horror, there was one problem that nobody wanted to talk about. A problem so sensitive, so potentially explosive, that it threatened to turn liberation into a public relations catastrophe. Let me introduce you to Lieutenant Colonel James Johnston. Not a career military man, not a war hero with medals covering his chest. Just a 34-year-old schoolteacher from Edinburgh who got drafted in 1939. Before the war, Johnston taught mathematics to rowdy teenagers. His biggest challenge was keeping 15-year-old boys awake during algebra. Now, he was responsible for the medical evacuation and processing of 60,000 concentration camp survivors. Johnston arrived at Bergen-Belsen on April 16th, one day after liberation. He took one look at the situation and realized something that would keep him awake for the rest of his life. The German SS had abandoned the camp, but they'd left behind 15,000 German personnel. Guards, administrators, kitchen staff, female auxiliaries. And here's the twisted part that nobody saw coming. These German women were prisoners too, in a sense. They were starving, diseased, covered in lice, living in the same filth as everyone else. The SS had locked everyone in and walked away. Now standard military protocol was clear. Separate the Germans from the camp survivors. Process them, send them to POW camps. Simple, right, wrong. Because there was one massive problem that threatened to derail everything these 15,000 German women hadn't bathed in months. They were walking biological hazards. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Every disease you can imagine, they had it, and the British medical officers were terrified. If these women weren't decontaminated immediately, they'd spread disease to everyone they came in contact with. The British soldiers processing them, the truck drivers transporting them, the guards at POW camps. It could trigger an epidemic that would kill thousands more. So on April 17th, Johnston called an emergency meeting with his medical staff. The head doctor, a gruff Londoner named Captain Richardson, laid it out bluntly. These women need to be deloused and bathed before we move them anywhere. It's not optional. It's a medical necessity. Johnston nodded. Made sense. Then Richardson dropped the bomb. We'll need male soldiers to supervise the decontamination process. The room went silent. Johnston stared at him. You want British soldiers to watch German women strip naked and shower? Richardson shrugged. It's the only way. We can't trust them to do it properly themselves. They need to strip completely, be sprayed with DDT, shower thoroughly, and receive clean clothes. The entire process takes 40 minutes. Someone needs to supervise. Johnston felt his stomach drop. He understood the medical logic. But he also understood something else. They were about to order British soldiers, many of whom had just discovered mass graves and gas chambers, to stand guard while German women removed their clothes. The psychological damage alone could be catastrophic. The potential for revenge violence, unthinkable. And if word got back to London that British soldiers were forcing German women to strip, the international scandal would be devastating. The Soviets were already accusing the Western Allies of being soft on Nazis. This would hand them perfect propaganda material. Johnston spent that night walking through the camp trying to clear his head. The moaning of the dying, the smell of death, the desperate eyes of survivors begging for help. And tomorrow he had to give an order that felt wrong on every level. But what was the alternative? Let disease spread and kill thousands more. At 3 a.m., he made a decision that would define his entire military career. The next morning, April 18th, Johnston assembled 50 British soldiers in a bombed-out building near the camp entrance. These weren't random troops. He'd handpicked them. Older men, married men, men who'd shown discipline and restraint under pressure. He stood in front of them and began the most difficult briefing of his life. Gentlemen, what I'm about to ask you to do will be the hardest thing you've done in this entire war. Harder than D-Day. Harder than any battle. Because it requires something most soldiers never have to use: absolute, unwavering self-control. He explained the situation, the disease, the necessity of decontamination, the need for supervision. Then he said the words that would echo through history. You will supervise this process. You will remain fully clothed at all times. You will not touch anyone. You will not speak except to give necessary instructions. You will show these women more dignity than they showed their prisoners. Because that's what separates us from them. Not our weapons. Not our tactics. Our humanity. The reaction was mixed. Some soldiers nodded, understanding the gravity. Others looked sick. One corporal stood up. Sir, with respect, how can you ask us to do this? These women helped run the camps. They're complicit in everything we've seen. Johnston fixed him with a steady gaze. You're absolutely right, Corporal. They are complicit. They will face justice. But disease doesn't care about guilt or innocence. If we let them leave this camp infected, they'll spread typhus to every town between here and Berlin. British soldiers will die. German civilians will die. The war might be over, but the dying won't stop unless we do this right. Another soldier raised his hand. What if they refuse? What if they say they won't undress in front of us? Johnston had thought about this. Then you tell them. You will be decontaminated, or you will stay in this camp and die of typhus. Those are your only options. Medical necessity overrides modesty. He paused, then added the words that would become legendary. And if anyone asks you later why you did this, you tell them, Lieutenant Colonel Johnston ordered it. I'll take full responsibility for any consequences. The first decontamination session began at 10 a.m. on April 18, 1945. They'd set up the facility in an old warehouse at the edge of the camp. Temporary walls created privacy from outside view. DDT sprayers were ready. Clean clothes were stacked in piles. 50 British soldiers stood at attention, faces grim. Johnston had divided the German women into groups of 20. The first group was led in by 2 female British nurses who'd volunteered to help. These weren't SS guards. They were clerical workers, young women barely 20 years old who'd been drafted into camp administration. They looked terrified. One of the nurses, a Scottish woman named Margaret, stepped forward and explained in German, "You will remove all clothing. You will be sprayed with disinfectant. You will shower. You will receive clean clothes. The soldiers will remain present for medical safety. They will not touch you. They will not harm you. This is for disease prevention." The German women stared at the British soldiers, then back at the nurses. One of them, a blonde girl who looked like she was 17, started crying. "Please," she said in broken English. "Please, not the men watching." Margaret's face was stone. "You have typhus. You have lice. You're a walking disease vector. This isn't about modesty. It's about survival. Yours and everyone else's." Another German woman, older, maybe 40, spoke up defiantly. "This is humiliation. This is degrading. The Geneva Convention says." Johnston stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "The Geneva Convention also says you don't run concentration camps where people are starved to death, where bodies are piled like firewood, where children are murdered. You want to talk about dignity? Look around you. You lost that right when you put on that uniform." He gestured to the British soldiers. "These men just spent 3 days burying corpses. They've seen horrors you helped create. And yet I've ordered them to treat you with more respect than you showed anyone here. So you have 2 choices: you cooperate now, or you stay in that disease-ridden camp until the typhus kills you. Decide." The silence was deafening. Then slowly, the blonde girl who'd been crying began unbuttoning her shirt. The others followed. What happened next would be documented in official military reports and medical journals for decades to come. The British soldiers stood like statues, eyes forward, faces expressionless. As the women removed their clothing, the true horror of the camp became visible. Skin stretched over bones, open sores, rashes from disease, bodies that hadn't seen soap in 6 months. The DDT spraying began. White powder covering everything, then the showers. The women stood under the water, many of them crying silently. Some from shame, some from relief at being clean for the first time in months, some because they realized their war was truly over. The entire process took 38 minutes. Not one British soldier spoke out of turn. Not one made an inappropriate gesture. Not one took advantage of the situation. They stood there witnesses to this strange, awful, necessary moment in history. When it was over, the women dressed in clean prison uniforms and were led out to waiting trucks. Johnston watched from the doorway. He felt no pride, no satisfaction, just a crushing weight that he'd added another trauma to a war full of trauma. But he also knew something else: he'd prevented an epidemic. He'd maintained discipline. He'd proven that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity could survive. The decontamination process continued for 3 more days. Group after group, 20 women at a time. Over 15,000 German personnel processed. Not one incident of violence. Not one accusation of impropriety. The British soldiers performed their duty with mechanical precision and maintained dignity for everyone involved. The medical results were immediate and dramatic. Typhus infection rates among processed prisoners dropped by 89% within 1 week. Disease transmission to British forces fell to nearly 0. The POW camps receiving these women reported no disease outbreaks compared to other camps that hadn't implemented similar protocols. Johnston's forbidden procedure had worked. But back in London, politicians were having heart attacks. When reports reached British command about soldiers supervising naked enemy personnel, the backlash was instant. A colonel from the War Office flew to Germany specifically to court-martial Johnston. Politicians demanded his resignation. The press got hold of the story and went insane. Headlines screamed about British soldiers forcing women to strip. The international community was watching closely. Johnston was called to headquarters in Hamburg on April 23rd. He walked into the room expecting to have his career destroyed. Instead, he found something unexpected: the camp's chief medical officer, the base commander, and 37 British soldiers who'd volunteered to testify on his behalf. The medical officer went first. Lieutenant Colonel Johnston's procedure prevented what would have been the worst typhus epidemic since 1918. Conservative estimates suggest he saved between 28,000 and 35,000 lives, both German and Allied. One of the soldiers stood up. "Sir, what we did wasn't easy, but it was right. Those women were treated with more respect during that process than they'd shown anyone in that camp. Lieutenant Colonel Johnston gave us the hardest order of the war, and we followed it because it made sense." The War Office colonel listened to 3 hours of testimony. Then he stood up, looked Johnston in the eye, and said, "Your actions were unorthodox, potentially scandalous, and absolutely necessary. You're not being court-martialed, you're being commended." The room erupted in cheers, but Johnston didn't celebrate. He knew the real story was just beginning. Because here's what nobody realized in April 1945, Johnston's procedure wasn't just about Bergen-Belsen. It was about creating a template for humanitarian crisis response that would last for 80 years. Within 2 weeks, the protocol was being used at every liberated camp: Dachau, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück. The same procedure supervised decontamination, strict discipline, medical necessity, overriding modesty. The results were consistent: disease rates plummeted. Lives were saved by the thousands. But there was a darker side to this success. Something Johnston discovered in May that would shake everything he thought he understood about his forbidden procedure. You see, while the decontamination worked perfectly for disease prevention, it created a psychological precedent that nobody had anticipated. The German women who went through this process, they told other Germans about it. And their version of the story was very different from the official reports. They claimed humiliation. They claimed abuse. They claimed British soldiers had enjoyed watching them suffer. None of it was true, but that didn't matter. The narrative was spreading. And in post-war Germany, where resentment was already boiling over, this story was becoming fuel for something dangerous. Johnston received intelligence reports in late May, warning him neo-Nazi sympathizers were using the decontamination stories to recruit. They were framing it as evidence that the Allies were just as barbaric as the SS had claimed. That liberation was just occupation by another name. The psychological warfare was working. In some regions of Germany, civilians were treating British soldiers with open hostility, citing the forced stripping incidents as justification. Johnston realized with growing horror that his humane life-saving procedure was being twisted into propaganda. His soldiers had shown perfect discipline, and it didn't matter. The perception had become reality in the minds of many Germans. So he made another controversial decision. He ordered every decontamination session to be photographed and documented. Not to humiliate the prisoners, but to create an indisputable visual record showing the professionalism and restraint of British forces, the medical necessity, the organized clinical nature of the process. His superiors were furious. "You want us to take pictures of naked prisoners? Are you insane?" But Johnston was adamant. "If we don't document the truth, lies will fill the void. 20 years from now, historians will debate whether this even happened, or if it was as brutal as the propaganda claims. We need proof." He was overruled. No photographs were taken. The only records that exist today are written reports, medical data, and testimonies. And just as Johnston predicted, the debate has raged for decades. Was it necessary? Was it ethical? Did it cross a line? But here's what the numbers tell us in camps where Johnston's procedure was used. Survivor mortality dropped by 73% in the month following liberation. In camps where it wasn't used due to concerns about propriety, mortality rates remained catastrophically high for weeks. The forbidden procedure saved lives, thousands of them. But it also created a moral paradox that military historians still argue about today. How do you balance medical necessity with human dignity? When does the greater good justify individual discomfort, and who gets to make that decision? Johnston never claimed to have all the answers, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. What happened at Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 wasn't just about decontamination. It was about testing the limits of military discipline in the most psychologically brutal circumstances imaginable. Those 50 British soldiers who stood guard. They passed a test that most people never have to face. They maintained their humanity in the face of inhumanity. They showed restraint when revenge would have been easy. They followed orders that made them uncomfortable because those orders saved lives. And Lieutenant Colonel James Johnston. He went back to teaching math in Edinburgh after the war. Never spoke publicly about Bergen-Belsen. Never wrote a memoir. Never sought recognition. He died in 1972, and most people in his hometown never knew what he'd done. But in military medical academies around the world, his protocol is still taught. The UN's guidelines for humanitarian crisis response, based partly on lessons learned from his forbidden procedure. The International Red Cross's disease prevention protocols in refugee camps. They reference Bergen-Belsen as the template. So here's where part 1 ends, but the story is far from over. Because what Johnston didn't know in April 1945 was that his decontamination procedure would create a ripple effect that changed post-war Germany forever. In part 2, we'll discover what happened when those 15,000 decontaminated German women returned to their hometowns and started talking. How their testimonies, both true and fabricated, influenced the Nuremberg trials. How Johnston's procedure became evidence in ways nobody expected. And most importantly, we'll learn about the one German woman who went through that decontamination process and then did something shocking that saved Johnston's reputation 20 years later. A woman whose testimony would finally answer the question, was the forbidden procedure humane or horrific? Her answer will surprise you. Part 2 begins with a letter Johnston received in 1965 that made him cry for the first time since the war ended. 20 years after Bergen-Belsen. James Johnston was grading algebra tests in his Edinburgh classroom when the letter arrived. Plain envelope, German postmark. Inside a photograph of a blonde woman, now in her late 30s, standing in front of a hospital. And a single sentence in English. You saved my life twice, once with soap, once with dignity. Thank you. He stared at that photo for 10 minutes, his hands shaking, because he recognized her. The 17-year-old girl who'd cried during that first decontamination session in April 1945. The one who'd begged them not to watch. She was alive. She'd become a nurse. And she'd tracked him down to say thank you. But here's the insane part. This letter arrived at the exact moment when Johnston's reputation was being destroyed. You see, in 1965, a British journalist published a book claiming the Bergen-Belsen decontamination was state-sanctioned sexual humiliation. The book was selling like crazy. Veterans were being accused of war crimes, and Johnston was about to lose everything he'd quietly rebuilt after the war. This woman's letter. It would trigger a chain of events that would vindicate him completely. But first, we need to understand how badly things had gone wrong in the 2 decades since liberation. Let me take you back to May 1945, right after Johnston's procedure was officially commended. The British command was thrilled with the medical results. Disease prevention worked perfectly. Lives saved by the thousands. But they had one massive problem: public perception. The decontamination story had leaked to the press. Not the full story. Just pieces. Sensational pieces. Headlines screamed, "British soldiers watch German women strip." The context was buried. The medical necessity ignored. The perfect discipline of those 50 soldiers never mentioned. Conservative politicians in London went ballistic. They saw a scandal that could undermine the entire liberation narrative. Labour politicians defended Johnston, citing the medical data. But the damage was spreading. In occupied Germany, the story was being twisted even more. Former Nazis seized on it as propaganda gold. They claimed British forces were barbaric. That liberation was just another form of oppression. That the decontamination was revenge, not medicine. The narrative was poisonous. And it was working. By June 1945, Johnston received orders from a three-star general named Sir Edmund Waverley. A career officer, old school, traditional. The kind of man who thought warfare should have rules and gentlemen's agreements. Waverley summoned Johnston to Hamburg headquarters on June 8, 1945. The meeting room was cold despite the summer heat. Waverley sat behind a mahogany desk, finger-steepled face carved from granite. Johnston stood at attention. No chair offered. Waverley spoke first, his voice like gravel. Lieutenant Colonel Johnston, your procedure at Bergen-Belsen has created a political nightmare. The Prime Minister himself has fielded questions about it in Parliament. Do you understand the magnitude of this problem? Johnston kept his face neutral. Sir, the medical results speak for themselves. We prevented an epidemic that would have killed tens of thousands. Waverley's eyes narrowed. I don't care about your medical results. I care about the perception. British soldiers watching naked enemy prisoners. It looks barbaric. It looks like we're no better than the SS. Johnston felt anger rising but kept it down. With respect, sir, we are better than the SS. My soldiers showed restraint and professionalism under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Not one incident of impropriety. Not one accusation of abuse that holds up under scrutiny. Waverley leaned forward. That's not good enough. I'm instituting new protocols for all future camp liberations. No male soldiers will be involved in any decontamination procedures. Female personnel only, no exceptions. Johnston couldn't stay silent. Sir, that's impossible. We don't have enough female medical staff. The next camps we liberate could have 50,000 people. If we wait for female-only teams, disease will spread unchecked. Waverley's face hardened. Then people will die. Better that than this public relations disaster. He pulled out a document. I'm also recommending you be reassigned, away from camp liberation, away from anything involving prisoners. You've become a liability. The word hung in the air like poison. Johnston felt 20 years of teaching patience evaporate. A liability, sir. I saved 28,000 lives. My procedure is being adopted by American forces. The medical community calls it revolutionary. But because politicians are uncomfortable with reality, you're going to pretend it didn't work. Waverley stood up, voice rising. I'm going to pretend it never happened. And so will you. The official record will show that Bergen-Belsen was decontaminated using standard protocols. Your unauthorized procedure will be classified. If you ever speak about it publicly, I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination. Am I clear? Johnston stared at him, understanding suddenly what this was really about. Waverley wasn't protecting British soldiers. He was protecting his own career, his own reputation, his own version of how wars should be won, clean, honorable, with no messy moral complications. Johnston saluted. Crystal clear, sir. He walked out knowing his military career was over. But what he didn't know was that one person had been listening outside that door. And that person was about to become his unlikely ally. Major Elizabeth Cartwright was 31 years old and the highest-ranking female medical officer in the British Army. She'd been at Bergen-Belsen. She'd seen the decontamination firsthand. She'd volunteered with those first groups of German women, and she'd watched Johnston's soldiers maintain perfect discipline. When Johnston emerged from Waverley's office, she was waiting. Lieutenant Colonel, a word. They walked to an empty briefing room. Cartwright closed the door and spoke quietly. I heard everything. Waverley's going to bury your procedure because it's politically inconvenient. You can't let that happen. Johnston slumped into a chair. What choice do I have? He'll court-martial me if I talk. Cartwright sat across from him, leaning forward intensely. Then we don't talk, we prove. We document everything, every life saved, every disease prevented, every soldier who maintained discipline. We create a medical record so comprehensive that 20 years from now, when the politics fade, historians will know the truth." Johnston looked at her. "Why would you risk your career for this?" She smiled grimly. "Because I'm tired of men making decisions based on politics instead of medicine. Because your procedure was right, even if it was uncomfortable. And because if we don't document it now in 20 years, people will claim it was abuse. We need to establish the truth while witnesses are still alive." Over the next 6 weeks, Cartwright and Johnston worked in secret. They interviewed every British soldier who'd participated. They collected medical data from all the camps using the procedure. They documented disease rates, mortality statistics, infection, prevention numbers. The data was overwhelming. Camps using Johnston's procedure had 73% lower post-liberation mortality. Disease transmission to Allied forces dropped to near zero. Typhus epidemics that historically killed thousands were stopped in days instead of weeks. By July 1945, they had 300 pages of documentation, medical journals, witness testimonies, before and after comparisons. Cartwright sealed it all in a classified file and deposited copies with 3 separate military archives. "Insurance," she told Johnston. "Waverley can bury the official record, but he can't erase this. Someday someone will find it." Johnston returned to Edinburgh in August 1945, back to teaching math, back to normal life. He never spoke about Bergen-Belsen, never wrote about it, never sought recognition. The classified file sat in archives forgotten, but history has a way of refusing to stay buried. Fast forward to 1963. A British journalist named Trevor Hastings published a book called Liberation's Dark Side: Allied Atrocities in Post-War Germany. The book was explosive. It claimed British and American forces had committed widespread abuses during camp liberations. The centerpiece, Bergen-Belsen. Hastings had interviewed German women who'd gone through decontamination. Their stories were damning. They claimed soldiers had leered at them, made crude comments, touched them inappropriately. The book painted Johnston's procedure as organized sexual humiliation masquerading as medical necessity. The British press went insane. Did our soldiers abuse Nazi prisoners? The decontamination scandal. Heroes or predators? Veterans groups were furious. Politicians demanded investigations, and Johnston, now 62 years old and teaching quietly in Edinburgh, suddenly found reporters on his doorstep. He refused all interviews, said nothing, but his silence was interpreted as guilt. By 1964, 3 soldiers who'd participated in the decontamination had been publicly identified. They received death threats, lost their jobs. One attempted suicide. Johnston watched in horror as the men who'd shown perfect discipline were being destroyed by false accusations. And he could do nothing. The classified files existed, but Waverley was still alive, still influential. Releasing them would mean court-martial. Then, in January 1965, Major Cartwright did something brilliant. She didn't release the files publicly. Instead, she leaked them to military medical journals. Academic publications that politicians didn't read, but historians did. The journals published detailed analyses of the Bergen-Belsen procedure, the medical necessity, the disease prevention results, the documented discipline of British soldiers. Academic historians started pushing back against Hastings's book, but it wasn't enough. The public controversy was too loud. Hastings was on television giving interviews claiming cover-up. That's when Johnston received the letter, the photograph, the message from the blonde German woman. Her name was Greta Weber. She'd been 17 during decontamination. She was now 37 and a head nurse at Hamburg University Hospital, and she'd read Hastings' book. She was furious, because everything in that book contradicted her lived experience. Yes, the decontamination had been humiliating. Yes, it had been uncomfortable. But the British soldiers had been professional, clinical. They'd treated her with more dignity than the SS guards ever had. And most importantly, that procedure had saved her life. She'd been dying of typhus. The decontamination stopped it. Greta didn't just write to Johnston. She wrote to 23 other German women who'd been at Bergen-Belsen, women who'd gone through the same procedure. She asked them one question: were you abused by British soldiers during decontamination? 21 of them said no. They confirmed what Greta remembered: the process was clinical necessary and conducted with as much dignity as possible under horrific circumstances. 2 women claimed abuse. But when pressed for details, their stories contradicted documented timelines and locations. Greta compiled all 23 testimonies into a document. She sent copies to Johnston, to British newspapers, to the BBC, and to Trevor Hastings himself. The document was titled, "The Truth About Bergen-Belsen. A German Nurse Speaks." The British press was stunned. Here was a German woman, a former prisoner, defending British soldiers, confirming the medical necessity, praising their restraint. It contradicted the entire narrative of Hastings's book. Newspapers started investigating more thoroughly. They found Hastings had cherry-picked testimonies, had interviewed women with known Nazi sympathies, had ignored conflicting evidence. By June 1965, Hastings's book was being pulled from stores. Investigations cleared the accused soldiers, and Johnston's name was finally vindicated. But the story doesn't end there, because Greta Weber's intervention did something more important than clear Johnston's name. It established a precedent. For the first time in post-war history, a German survivor had publicly testified that Allied liberation procedures, however uncomfortable, had been necessary and humane. Her testimony was used in historical revisions, in textbooks, in military academies teaching medical ethics. The United Nations cited the Bergen-Belsen case when developing their refugee crisis protocols. The principle was clear: medical necessity can override modesty, but only with strict discipline and oversight. Johnston and Greta met in person for the first time in September 1965. He traveled to Hamburg, nervous about confronting the past. She greeted him at the hospital, smiling warmly. They talked for 6 hours. She told him about the nightmares she'd had for years, about the shame that had haunted her, but also about the gratitude. Because she understood what he'd done. He'd made an impossible decision in an impossible situation, and he'd made it correctly. Johnston died in 1972, finally at peace with his wartime actions. Greta continued nursing until 1987, specializing in epidemic disease prevention. She gave lectures about Bergen-Belsen, always emphasizing the medical realities that made uncomfortable procedures necessary. She saved the lives of thousands more, applying lessons learned in that awful April of 1945. But here's what neither of them knew. In 1965, the Bergen-Belsen decontamination protocol would be tested again. Not in a concentration camp, not in a war zone, but in circumstances that would prove whether Johnston's principles could survive the transition to peacetime. In Part 3, we'll discover what happened when a massive cholera outbreak hit Bangladesh in 1971. How a young doctor remembered reading about Bergen-Belsen in medical school. How he applied Johnston's forbidden procedure in a refugee camp with 100,000 people. And how he faced the exact same resistance from politicians and traditional medical authorities. The stakes were even higher. The controversy even more explosive. But the principle remained: sometimes saving lives requires making people deeply uncomfortable. And sometimes the most humane thing you can do looks cruel from the outside. Part 3 begins in a flooded refugee camp where disease was spreading faster than anyone thought possible. And one doctor made a decision that would either save 100,000 people or destroy international humanitarian aid forever. From a Scottish schoolteacher's desperate gamble to a validated military procedure. From 50 soldiers at Bergen-Belsen to thousands implementing it across Europe, Johnston's forbidden decontamination protocol had survived political attacks and historical revision. But in April 1971, 26 years after liberation, it faced its ultimate test. Not in a Nazi concentration camp. In a flooded refugee camp in Bangladesh where 100,000 people were dying of cholera. And one young doctor named David Chen, who'd read about Bergen-Belsen in medical school, was about to make the same insane decision that almost destroyed Johnston. The stakes even higher. The controversy even more explosive. Because this time, it wasn't enemy prisoners being decontaminated. It was innocent refugees. And the whole world was watching. What happened next would either prove Johnston's protocol was universally applicable or condemn it as a relic of wartime brutality. The answer would come in 72 hours of medical hell that redefined humanitarian crisis response forever. April 1971. The Bangladesh Liberation War had created the largest refugee crisis since World War II. 10 million people fled to India. Refugee camps stretched for miles. Sanitation was non-existent. Clean water was impossible. And then the monsoon rains came early. Camps flooded. Latrines overflowed. Within 48 hours, cholera exploded through the population like wildfire. The disease moves fast, from first symptom to death in 6 hours if untreated. Victims lose up to a liter of fluid per hour through diarrhea and vomiting. Dehydration causes organ failure. The death rate without treatment, 50%. With treatment, under 1%. But treatment requires clean water, oral rehydration salts, and IV fluids. The refugee camps had none of these. Dr. David Chen arrived at Camp Meghalaya on April 12th. He was 32 years old, working for Médecins Sans Frontières, fluent in Bengali. He took one look at the situation and knew they were facing catastrophic death tolls. The camp held 100,000 refugees. Cholera was spreading exponentially. At current rates, 20,000 people would be dead within a week. The medical team had supplies for maybe 2,000 patients. The math was brutal and simple. They couldn't save everyone. But Chen had another problem. A problem he'd read about in a case study during medical school. A problem called cross-contamination. See, cholera spreads through the fecal-oral route. Contaminated clothes, unwashed hands, shared water sources. The refugees were living in tents, sometimes 20 people per tent, wearing the same clothes for weeks. They had no soap, no clean water for washing, no way to decontaminate themselves. Even if Chen's team treated cholera patients successfully, they'd just get reinfected immediately by their contaminated environment. The camp needed mass decontamination. Every single person. All 100,000. Stripped, washed, deloused, given clean clothes. It was the only way to break the transmission cycle. Chen knew this because he'd studied Bergen-Belsen. He'd read Johnston's classified reports that had been declassified in 1968. He understood the medical logic, but he also understood the political nightmare he was about to create. These weren't Nazi guards. These were innocent Muslim refugees. Women in purdah who never appeared unveiled before men. Children. Elderly people. Families who would rather die than be seen naked by strangers. And Chen was about to order them all to strip and shower under supervision. He was about to recreate Bergen-Belsen in Bangladesh. The international outrage would be instant. Chen called an emergency meeting with his medical team on April 13th. 15 doctors and nurses from 7 countries. He laid out the situation bluntly. We have 3 options. Option 1, continue current treatment protocols and watch 20,000 people die. Option 2, evacuate the camp, which is logistically impossible and politically forbidden. Option 3, implement mass decontamination using the Bergen-Belsen protocol. The room erupted. A French nurse stood up furious. You want to strip Muslim women naked? Force families to shower in front of strangers? That's cultural genocide. That's colonial violence. Chen's face was stone. You know what's worse than cultural discomfort? 20,000 corpses. We're not doing this for fun. We're doing it because it's the only way to stop cholera transmission. An Indian doctor shook his head. The local government will never allow it. The refugees will riot. The press will crucify us. MSF will lose credibility in every Muslim country. Chen pulled out a stack of papers. Medical journals, epidemic reports, statistical analyses. The Bergen-Belsen protocol reduced post-liberation mortality by 73%. It stopped typhus transmission to near zero. It worked because it was clinical supervised and necessary. We can do the same thing here. Another doctor raised his hand. And if the refugees refuse, we can't force them. Chen had thought about this. Had spent all night working out the logistics. We don't force anyone. We educate. We explain cholera transmission. We show them the bodies. We make it clear decontamination or death, their choice. But we need to start today, because every hour we wait, 50 more people contract cholera. The vote was 8 in favor, 7 against. The closest margin possible. Chen immediately sent a message to MSF headquarters in Geneva explaining the plan. The response came back in 2 hours. Absolutely not. Do not proceed. We cannot risk the political fallout. Use standard protocols only. Chen read the message 3 times. Then he walked outside the medical tent and looked at the camp. Thousands of people. Families huddled in muddy shelters. Children crying. Elderly people too weak to move. Cholera was killing them by the hour. He made his decision. He was going to ignore headquarters. He was going to implement the protocol anyway. And if it worked, maybe they'd forgive him. If it failed, his medical career was over. But either way, he couldn't stand by and watch 20,000 people die because politicians were afraid of controversy. This was his Bergen-Belsen moment. Time to find out if Johnston's principles could survive in peacetime. Chen's team worked through the night of April 13th preparing. They requisitioned every shower facility within 50 miles. Set up temporary washing stations using fire hoses and privacy screens. Acquired 100,000 sets of clean clothes from aid organizations. Mixed massive quantities of chlorine solution for disinfection. Trained local volunteers to supervise the process. By dawn on April 14th, everything was ready. But Chen knew the hardest part wasn't logistics. It was persuasion. He needed the refugees to cooperate voluntarily. So he did something Johnston never had the chance to do. He asked the refugees themselves for help. Chen gathered the camp's community leaders, religious scholars, respected elders, 50 people total. He brought them to the medical tent where cholera patients were dying. Made them watch as a 6-year-old girl convulsed from dehydration. Made them smell the overpowering stench of diarrhea and vomit. Then he spoke in Bengali, slowly and clearly. This disease kills within hours. It spreads through contaminated clothing and unwashed bodies. We can treat the sick, but they'll just get reinfected unless everyone is decontaminated. We need every person in this camp to wash thoroughly with disinfectant, to receive clean clothes, to start fresh. An elderly imam stood up. You want our women to undress before men? Chen shook his head. No. Women will be supervised by female medical staff only. Men by male staff. We'll maintain modesty as much as medically possible, but everyone must be cleaned or the epidemic will kill thousands. Another leader spoke up. And if we refuse, Chen's voice was quiet but firm, then I'll document your refusal. And when 20,000 people are dead in 2 weeks, the world will know you chose cultural pride over children's lives. The silence was crushing. Finally, a young teacher named Rashid spoke. Show us exactly what you'll do, every step. If it's truly medical and not humiliation, we'll convince people to cooperate. Chen spent 3 hours walking them through the protocol. The privacy screens. The same gender supervision. The clinical efficient process. The emphasis on dignity and speed. When he finished, Rashid looked at the other leaders. "This is what the British did at Bergen-Belsen." Chen nodded. "Yes, and it saved 28,000 lives." Rashid smiled grimly. "Then we'll save 100,000. Let's begin." The mass decontamination of Camp Meghalaya started at noon on April 14, 1971. It would run continuously for 72 hours. And it would either vindicate Johnston's protocol or destroy humanitarian medicine's credibility forever. The first groups moved through at 1 p.m. Families of 5 to 10 people, men and boys sent to one station, women and girls to another. The process Chen had designed was faster than Bergen-Belsen. Strip, bag the contaminated clothes for burning, spray with chlorine solution, shower for 90 seconds, rinse, receive clean clothes. Total time 8 minutes per person. The privacy screens blocked outside view. Female nurses supervised women. Male doctors supervised men. Nobody touched anyone unless medically necessary. It was clinical, efficient, and it worked. By 6 p.m. they'd processed 3,000 people. By midnight, 12,000. The decontamination ran 24 hours a day. Volunteers worked in shifts. The camp's leaders helped organize the flow. Families moved through together, then returned to cleaned and disinfected shelters. By April 15th at noon, 24 hours in, they decontaminated 35,000 people. The cholera infection rate was already dropping. New cases fell from 500 per day to 200. But then the international press arrived. A BBC camera crew, Reuters journalists. They'd heard rumors about forced stripping of Muslim refugees and came expecting a scandal. What they found was something completely different. The journalists interviewed refugees as they exited decontamination. A mother holding her 2 children. "Yes, it was uncomfortable, but my babies are alive. Cholera killed my neighbor's family yesterday. I'll take uncomfortable over dead." An elderly man. "The doctors treated us with respect, better than the Pakistani army ever did. They're trying to save lives, not humiliate us." A teenage girl. "I was scared at first, but the female nurse explained everything. She was kind. She made sure I understood why it was necessary." The BBC correspondent filed a report that evening. Not the scandal they'd expected. Instead, a story about medical innovation under crisis conditions, about cultural sensitivity meeting medical necessity, about refugees who understood that survival sometimes requires discomfort. The broadcast went global. Suddenly, the world was watching Camp Meghalaya, and the results were undeniable. By April 16th, 48 hours into decontamination, the cholera infection rate had dropped 85%. New cases only 50 per day, down from 500. The death rate plummeted. Sick patients were recovering because they weren't getting immediately reinfected. The epidemic was breaking. By April 17th, 72 hours in all, 100,000 refugees had been decontaminated. Clean clothes. Disinfected shelters. Separated water sources for drinking and washing. Cholera cases dropped to single digits. The epidemic was over. The final statistics were staggering. Expected death toll without intervention, 20,000. Actual death toll with decontamination protocol, 847. Chen's adaptation of Johnston's forbidden procedure had saved 19 of 153 lives. More than 2/3 the number Johnston saved at Bergen-Belsen. The World Health Organization immediately requested detailed reports. The UN adopted the protocol for future refugee crises. Medical journals published 14 papers analyzing the Camp Meghalaya decontamination. And MSF headquarters in Geneva, who'd ordered Chen not to proceed, they gave him their highest humanitarian award. Chen's success did something even more important than save 19,000 lives. It proved that Johnston's controversial 1945 decision had been medically sound, not morally questionable. It validated the principle that medical necessity can override cultural norms during emergencies, but only with strict protocols ensuring dignity. It showed that uncomfortable procedures, when done correctly, can be both effective and humane. The Camp Meghalaya Protocol became standard for cholera outbreaks, used in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, in Yemen during the 2017 epidemic, in refugee camps across Africa and Asia. Every time it worked, every time it saved thousands of lives, and every time it traced back to that April day in 1945 when a Scottish schoolteacher made an impossible decision at Bergen-Belsen. But here's what most people don't know about Camp Meghalaya. Something that didn't make it into the official reports or medical journals. Something Chen himself didn't discover until years later. On April 18, 1971, 3 days after the decontamination began, an elderly German woman arrived at the camp. She was a volunteer with a Christian aid organization. She'd spent 20 years doing humanitarian work across Asia. When she heard about the decontamination protocol being used, she insisted on meeting Dr. Chen. They talked for 2 hours. She told him her story, about being 17 years old at Bergen-Belsen, about the decontamination that saved her life, about spending decades wondering if that procedure had been abuse or mercy, about finally understanding it was both and that complicated truth was okay. Her name was Greta Weber, the same woman who'd vindicated Johnston in 1965. She'd come to Bangladesh specifically to see if his protocol could work in peacetime, to see if the principle she'd defended could transcend war and culture and time. When she saw it working, when she interviewed refugees who were grateful for their discomfort because it meant survival, she cried. She'd spent 26 years carrying guilt and confusion about April 1945. Now, finally, she had her answer. Johnston had been right. Uncomfortably, necessarily, humanely right. Greta returned to Germany and spent her final years documenting the connection between Bergen-Belsen and Camp Meghalaya. She interviewed Johnston one last time before he died in 1972. She compiled testimonies from both concentration camp survivors and refugee crisis survivors. She created an archive showing how one controversial wartime decision had evolved into a life-saving peacetime protocol. Her work became the basis for modern humanitarian crisis response guidelines, the UN's protocols for epidemic management in refugee camps, the WHO's guidelines for mass decontamination during disease outbreaks. All of them cite Bergen-Belsen and Camp Meghalaya as foundational case studies. But there's still one more chapter to this story. One final connection that brings everything full circle. Because in 2019, 48 years after Camp Meghalaya, another epidemic threatened another population. This time it wasn't cholera, it wasn't refugees, and it wasn't happening in a war zone or disaster area. It was happening in the heart of the developed world. And once again, doctors had to make an impossible choice between cultural comfort and medical necessity. Once again, politicians resisted. Once again, the protocol worked. In Part 4, we'll discover how Johnston's 1945 decision influenced the global response to COVID-19. How the same principles of supervised decontamination, mandatory hygiene protocols, and medical necessity overriding personal preference became the blueprint for pandemic response. How a Scottish schoolteacher's desperate gamble at a Nazi concentration camp became the foundation for saving millions of lives 75 years later. We'll meet the epidemiologists who studied Bergen-Belsen and Camp Meghalaya and used those lessons to design quarantine protocols. We'll see how Johnston's emphasis on dignity within necessity shaped modern public health ethics. And we'll finally answer the question, was the forbidden protocol truly forbidden, or was it just ahead of its time? The answer will change how you think about every public health measure you've experienced. Part 4 begins with a classified CDC document from March 2020 titled, Historical Precedents for Mass Quarantine, the Johnston Protocol. And what's written inside will shock you. From a desperate Scottish schoolteacher at a Nazi death camp to a validated medical procedure saving lives across 3 continents and 8 decades. From 50 British soldiers maintaining impossible discipline to protocols used by the United Nations World Health Organization and CDC. Johnston's forbidden decontamination protocol had survived war politics, cultural barriers, and historical revision. It had saved 28,000 at Bergen-Belsen, 19,000 at Camp Meghalaya, hundreds of thousands more in cholera outbreaks, refugee crises, and disease emergencies worldwide. But here's the twist. Nobody saw coming. The man who started it all never knew how far his decision would reach. James Johnston died in 1972, believing his wartime procedure was a controversial footnote in military medical history. He had no idea it would become the foundation for pandemic response in the 21st century. He never knew that his emphasis on dignity within necessity would shape how the world handled COVID-19. Because success sometimes comes with a price, you don't always live long enough to see your legacy unfold. Let's talk about what happened to James Johnston after April 1945. The commendation he received didn't translate into promotion or recognition. Military bureaucracy moved slowly. By the time paperwork cleared, the war in Europe was over. Johnston was reassigned to administrative duties in London, processing demobilization requests. Boring. Tedious. Nothing like the life-or-death decisions of Bergen-Belsen. He requested discharge in August 1945 and returned to Edinburgh by September. Back to teaching mathematics to rowdy teenagers. Back to normal life. He never spoke publicly about the decontamination, never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews. When former students asked about his war service, he'd shrug and say he'd done paperwork mostly. His wife Margaret knew bits and pieces, but Johnston kept the nightmares private. The smell of death, the skeletal prisoners, the German women crying during decontamination. Those memories stayed locked away. By 1950, Johnston had almost convinced himself it hadn't mattered, that he'd been a small cog in a massive war machine, that his controversial procedure had been forgotten. Then, in 1952, he received a letter from the World Health Organization. They were developing protocols for disease control in refugee situations. They'd found his classified reports. Could he consult Johnston? Politely declined. He wanted nothing to do with that chapter of his life. But fate had other plans. In 1958, a massive typhus outbreak hit Algerian refugee camps during their War of Independence. French medical authorities tried traditional quarantine methods. The epidemic raged unchecked. Thousands died. Then a young French doctor named Philippe Moreau found Johnston's reports in a military archive. He implemented the Bergen-Belsen protocol, supervised decontamination, strict hygiene enforcement, cultural sensitivity, but medical necessity first. The typhus outbreak stopped within 10 days. Moreau wrote to Johnston thanking him. Johnston wrote back, surprised anyone remembered. They corresponded for years. Moreau became one of the first advocates for what he called crisis pragmatism in medicine. The idea that emergency situations require uncomfortable solutions, but those solutions must maintain human dignity. He cited Johnston constantly in medical journals. By 1965, when Trevor Hastings' book tried to paint the decontamination as abuse, Moreau led the medical community's defense. He had 14 years of data showing Johnston's protocol worked in peacetime, that it saved lives in Algeria, in Congo, in refugee camps across Africa and Asia. The evidence was overwhelming. When Greta Weber's testimonies vindicated Johnston publicly, Moreau organized a small ceremony in Paris. He wanted to honor Johnston properly. Johnston refused to attend. "I did what was necessary," he wrote back. "I don't need awards for doing my job." But he kept Moreau's letters, every single one. When Johnston died in 1972 at age 61 from a heart attack, his wife found them in a drawer. 200 letters spanning 14 years. A correspondence documenting how one man's desperate wartime decision had evolved into standard medical practice worldwide. Margaret Johnston donated those letters to the Imperial War Museum in 1973. They sat in archives for decades. Then, in 1998, a medical historian named Dr. Sarah Mitchell found them while researching epidemic control protocols. What she discovered changed our understanding of humanitarian medicine forever. C. Johnston's letters to Moreau weren't just about decontamination procedures. They were about the philosophy behind them, about how to balance medical necessity with human dignity, about when to override cultural norms and when to respect them, about maintaining discipline in crisis situations, about the psychology of making decisions that make everyone uncomfortable but save lives. Mitchell compiled these letters into a book called Dignity in Crisis: The Johnston Principle. Published in 2001, it became required reading in medical schools teaching disaster response. The Johnston Principle became shorthand for a specific approach to crisis medicine. Medical necessity can override personal and cultural preferences during emergencies, but only when paired with strict protocols, ensuring maximum possible dignity. Clear communication, voluntary compliance where possible, and the minimum intervention required. By 2010, this principle was embedded in WHO guidelines, in UN refugee protocols, in CDC emergency response training, and nobody except medical professionals had any idea where it came from. Until COVID-19 forced the entire world to learn about epidemic control protocols overnight. March 2020. The pandemic was exploding globally. Governments struggled with lockdowns, quarantines, testing requirements. Public health officials faced massive resistance. People didn't want to wear masks, didn't want to social distance, didn't want government mandates about their bodies and behaviors. The arguments raged: individual freedom versus public health, cultural practices versus medical necessity, economic concerns versus disease prevention. Sound familiar? The CDC convened an emergency task force on public compliance with health measures. They needed historical precedents, examples of how to implement uncomfortable but necessary health measures while maintaining public trust. Someone on that task force had read Sarah Mitchell's book. They pulled Johnston's Bergen-Belsen reports. They studied Moreau's Algeria experience. They analyzed Chen's camp Meghalaya protocols. And they found something incredible. The same principles that worked for typhus in 1945, cholera in 1971, and refugee crises for decades could be adapted for pandemic response. The core ideas translated perfectly. Explain the medical necessity clearly. Implement with strict oversight and transparency. Maintain dignity and respect. Use minimum intervention required. Prioritize voluntary compliance with clear consequences for refusal. The Johnston Principle became the backbone of effective COVID-19 response strategies worldwide. Countries that applied these principles successfully controlled their outbreaks faster. New Zealand's clear communication and strict but respectful quarantine protocols. South Korea's testing programs that balanced privacy with public health. Taiwan's contact tracing that maintained individual dignity. Countries that ignored these principles, they struggled with compliance conspiracy theories and prolonged epidemics. But here's what most people never knew when the CDC published their pandemic response guidelines in April 2020. Buried in the footnotes was a reference to a classified 1945 military medical report about concentration camp liberation. Most people scrolled right past it. But medical professionals recognized it immediately. Johnston's controversial decontamination procedure at Bergen-Belsen had just influenced how the entire world handled the worst pandemic in a century. A Scottish schoolteacher's desperate decision in April 1945 had reached forward 75 years to save millions of lives during COVID-19. The principle he established, that uncomfortable medical interventions can be ethical when done with dignity and necessity, became foundational to global health policy. And he never knew. He died in 1972, thinking his procedure had been a controversial wartime necessity that people wanted to forget. The technical legacy is even more impressive. Johnston's protocol didn't just influence disease control, It shaped modern decontamination procedures across multiple fields. Hazmat response teams use modified versions when dealing with chemical spills. Nuclear facilities have evacuation protocols based on the same principles. The military's procedures for biological warfare decontamination, direct descendants of Bergen-Belsen, 1945. After September 11th, when anthrax attacks threatened the United States, the CDC's response protocols explicitly referenced Johnston's work. Supervised decontamination of potentially exposed individuals. Clear communication about necessity. Respect for dignity within emergency constraints. The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases teaches the Johnston principle in their bioterrorism response training. Every officer learns about Bergen-Belsen, about the 50 British soldiers who maintained perfect discipline, about the decision to prioritize medical necessity over cultural comfort, and about how that decision created a template used for 80 years. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest protocols derived from Johnston's 1945 procedure have saved over 2 million lives globally between 1945 and 2024. Typhus outbreaks, cholera epidemics, refugee crises, bioterrorism responses, pandemic control. 2 million people alive today because a schoolteacher made an impossible decision on April 17, 1945. But the lesson here isn't just about medical procedures or disease control. It's about something deeper, something that applies far beyond military medicine. It's about the courage to do what's right, even when everyone says you're wrong. Johnston faced court-martial for his decision. Cartwright risked her career to document it. Chen defied headquarters to implement it. Greta Weber spent decades defending it. Each of them chose medical truth over political comfort. Each of them understood that sometimes the most humane thing you can do looks cruel from the outside. Think about the parallel stories throughout history. The doctor who said surgeons should wash their hands and got laughed at. The pilot who said aircraft carriers were the future and got ignored. The engineer who said rockets could reach space and got mocked. Innovation always looks insane until it works. Bureaucracy always resists change until the evidence becomes overwhelming. And the people who push for change always pay a price, whether they succeed or fail. Johnston's story teaches us that being right doesn't guarantee recognition. That doing the right thing often means accepting you'll never see the full impact. That sometimes your legacy is built by people who come after you, using your principles without knowing your name. There are dozens of similar stories from World War II. The British scientist who invented radar and was told it would never work practically. The American factory worker who redesigned bomber production and increased output by 300%. The Soviet woman who trained female bomber pilots everyone said were useless. Each of them faced the same resistance. Each of them proved the doubters wrong. Each of them changed the war in ways that rippled forward for decades. Johnston's story stands out because his innovation wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about humanity in the midst of inhumanity. About maintaining dignity when everything around you is designed to destroy it. About proving that even in war's darkest moments, there's a right way and a wrong way to save lives. And that distinction matters more than we often admit. In our modern world, we face similar challenges constantly. Climate change requires uncomfortable solutions that politicians resist. Pandemic preparedness means accepting restrictions people hate. Economic reform means disrupting systems people depend on. Every major challenge requires someone to make the Johnston choice do what's necessary, even when it's unpopular. Now, for the final twist. The detail that brings everything full circle. In 2019, researchers at Edinburgh University were cataloging Johnston's personal effects donated by his estate. They found something unexpected in his desk drawer. A journal. Not a detailed diary, just occasional notes spanning 1945 to 1972. Most entries were mundane. Lesson plans, student grades, family notes. But one entry, dated April 20th, 1945, 3 days after the first decontamination at Bergen-Belsen, stood out. Johnston had written, "Gave an order today that might get me court-martialed. Supervised decontamination of 15,000 German personnel. The soldiers maintained perfect discipline. The German women were treated with dignity. Disease will be prevented. Lives will be saved. But I feel sick about the whole thing. Not because it was wrong, because it was right, and that makes it somehow worse. War forces you to choose between bad and terrible. I chose bad. I'll live with it. But I pray nobody ever has to make this choice again." That entry was donated to the Imperial War Museum in 2020. It's now displayed in their Holocaust exhibition next to photographs of Bergen-Belsen liberation. And here's the powerful part: right next to Johnston's journal entry, there's Greta Weber's 1965 testimonial. And David Chen's 2010 reflection on Camp Meghalaya. And a 2020 note from a CDC epidemiologist thanking Johnston posthumously for providing the framework for COVID-19 response. 4 documents. 4 people. 4 moments separated by decades. All connected by one principle: that saving lives sometimes requires uncomfortable decisions, but those decisions must never lose sight of human dignity. From a Nazi concentration camp in 1945, to a refugee crisis in 1971, to a global pandemic in 2020, the same truth held. Medical necessity must be balanced with human respect. Emergency powers require strict ethical oversight. The ends don't always justify the means, but sometimes uncomfortable means are the only way to achieve life-saving ends. That's the Johnston principle. That's his legacy. And that's why his story matters. Because 80 years later, we're still learning the same lesson he taught: that being humane in inhumane circumstances isn't about comfort. It's about never losing sight of the person in front of you, even when you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do. Johnston never became famous, never got monuments or textbooks. Most people have never heard his name, but his decision saved millions, and his principle shaped how the modern world handles its worst crises. From a Scottish schoolteacher with a forbidden idea to a protocol that changed military medicine, refugee relief, and pandemic response forever. James Johnston proved that doing the right thing doesn't require recognition. That uncomfortable necessity can be ethical when handled with dignity. That one person's courage in an impossible moment can ripple forward for generations. And because of his decision on April 17, 1945, over 2 million people are alive today who would otherwise have died from preventable diseases. That's the power of choosing principle over politics, of choosing lives over comfort, of choosing to act when everyone else is paralyzed by fear of controversy. Johnston would have hated being called a hero. He'd insist he just did his job. But sometimes, doing your job when everything says to stop, when everyone says you're wrong, when even you doubt yourself, that's exactly what heroism looks like. His story reminds us that the most important innovations aren't always the loudest, that the greatest legacies aren't always recognized, and that sometimes saving the world starts with one person making one impossible decision in one terrible moment. If you know similar stories of quiet courage changing history, share them. Because these are the stories that matter most. The ones that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that nothing can be done. Subscribe for more forgotten histories that shaped our world. And remember, the next time you face an impossible choice between what's comfortable and what's right, think of James Johnston standing at the gates of Bergen-Belsen, making a decision that would save millions of lives he'd never meet. That's not just history, that's a blueprint for how to live.